Are you ready to take some questions?
Sure am.
Awesome, thanks. The first one that I see that wasn't already kind of addressed in the chat is from David Trail, and he says, World War II vets generally were not welcomed home with hoopla and parades after the first month or so, but have become lionized or revered. Vietnam vets were ignored or abused. How do you think veterans from today's conflicts will be treated or respected in the future as they reach their 80s?
It's a very interesting question. I guess the temptation is to look at it in terms of somewhere you go to one extreme, you go to the other extreme, and then you end up in the middle. I think somewhere between those extremes is where that's probably going to come down. It seems like we're in a period now of, at least from the public perception, of constant war, that we're always going to have some veterans coming back with experiences, and but we also know from our experience in Vietnam that we better appreciate those who do go out and serve, and consequently we've seen the reaction, the thank you for your service, the all those different expressions that we see, and even if it's tempting to be cynical about them, I think quite a number, I think most of them are sincere. I think people do have more appreciation for what folks are going through, but there's also, given the dynamics of what's going on, it's almost like the military has become just another job, in a way. So somewhere in the middle there is what my anticipation is of it.
Thanks. See a whole questions coming in. I think maybe people are thinking what to ask. Do you have anything to share presentation while we wait to come?
I perhaps can talk a little bit more about John Dower and his book War Against Mercy on race war, and some of that is also discussed in Paul Fussel's Wartime. The different perceptions of the different foes that American GIs had going into these. The Italians didn't seem so bad. There were a lot of Italian Americans in the U.S. Army. By the time the Americans really came to grips with the Italians in the Mediterranean theater, the Italians really were fed up with the war, and there's just not the sense of animosity toward the Italians. The Germans' perceptions get kind of weird. They're just they seem like us, but they also have this they seem so wrong-headed, like robots, and so you get this notion of square-head Fritz. What's wrong with these guys? Why do they think the way they do? And of course, as they get more exposure to the Germans, and you have the booby traps and that people are going through, then the animosity starts to build. And of course, with the Holocaust, there's just utter disbelief that just how bad that is. But with the Japanese, you really do get the race element. That's I think perhaps we seem to go through these phases with the German Americans caught it in World War I. The Japanese Americans caught it in World War II. Just the whole business of this idea of race war, and the portrayal of Japanese. You look at the cartoons of the period. The stereotypes of the way Asians looked. The movies like Bataan. The Japanese soldiers in Bataan look like insects crawling over this is the kind of wartime image that you get. The kind of dehumanization, especially after Pearl Harbor, that makes it pretty easy to go out and have some of what you see in the Pacific War. And it went both ways. The Japanese were also, were also could be very vicious in terms of the prisoners of war. But there's a dynamic going on in the Pacific War that you don't see so much with the European War.
Certainly. From asks, you mentioned there are tropes of Americans being mechanical, and she has that expound or give examples of this in pop culture, so show her students.
Let's see. Am I coming through okay? Let me see if I can. I've got the question, I think, on the chat. Yeah, the question of Americans being mechanical. That's actually an interesting one. It started out more as a legend, but I think what you get. But there has been some documentation, and I think there's a lot to it. Americans spent the interwar years, and these are the years when we build the U.S. highway system, and the ability to cross the continent. One of Dwight Eisenhower's formative experiences is when he's part of that truck convoy that goes across America and the 48 states in the 1920s. And that gives him the notion later on of the interstate highway system. The kind of distance that Americans had to overcome is very interesting. But I think in terms of examples you can give your students, there's, just the Germans were amazed at the power, the type of vehicles the Americans had, the durability of the 2.5-ton trucks, the Jeeps. They weren't as impressed with the American tanks, but the American tanks were durable. They would go a lot longer than, say, the German Tiger tank. You could possibly show pictures of this, and it is true sometimes that this mechanical aptitude could work at a disadvantage. Came across an account by Jim Gavin, the commander of the 82nd Airborne, who talked about the drive across Sicily, where these paratroopers would, who were always walking, would liberate an Italian truck and try to get it to run, and they'd get it to run, it'd go for a few miles and then conk out, and instead of actually just keep pressing forward. So in that sense, it could be a little bit of a delay, but yeah, I mean, you look at popular culture, the fascination with automobiles, Henry Ford, it's very present. Even if Hitler came up with the Autobahn, Americans by the 1940s are getting increasingly mechanized culture.
Told me I was before, so about that. A bit of happening if I come through more clearly. Then from Mary McPherson, and she said, "Do you think war is over days in the context of since many used it to call it conflict?"
Well, there was a stretch in the 90s and 2000s, I think, when we'd apply war to just about anything, and that's Michael Sherry wrote a book, In the Shadow of War, which I'd highly recommend. He talks about this, the use of war imagery to mobilize. When Franklin Roosevelt faced the Great Depression in 1933, he responded in a way similar to the way the American government had responded to World War I. He used the war metaphor to mobilize the federal government and the American people to fight the Depression. And this war metaphor, I mean, look at, for a while there, we were using the war metaphor for just about everything. War on drugs, war on poverty, war on this, on that. And yes, but it's slippery, because war itself is, in terms, there's so many different types of conflict and how you respond to them, that it's just the term itself has become very nebulous.
Certainly. Told chop apologize. From Ray Sun asks, do you put on 1995 this type about the atomic bombs popular at change 1995?
Oh, I think they have. I think there definitely there's been some change on that. Just watch the TV set in the evening in the Black Lives Matter movement. I think there's been a lot of development along that line. But yeah, I think it would be more of a possibility, but I think there'd still be divisiveness about it. It's an interesting prospect. But there also might be more apathy in the sense as World War II recedes more and more into the distance, and a lot of what drove the 95 opposition to the Smithsonian were veterans groups, and but there was a lot of, even the way the subject was presented, I think even at the Center of Military History there was some discomfort with the way that exhibit was put out, and the Smithsonian, I think, got some confusing signals from some of the historians who were evaluating it, and that's a whole nother story. But it's too bad though that the institution got hammered the way it did. It had kind of a chilling effect on any kind of exhibit that wasn't triumphalist.
Hi, I'm gonna try reading some of these questions because Bailey is having some storm problems. So Ron Eisenman wrote, I love the focus of the talk. My essay question for world history class is to assess the following. World War II brought out the best and worst in humanity. I would love to find a condensed essay on this topic to share with 10th graders. Have you written anything? Can you suggest some other resources?
Yeah, any one particular source, I think I would talk about the things I'm thinking of offhand are probably a little involved for 10th graders. I wrote an essay on American attitudes toward war for the Journal of Military History back in 2011. That gets into a lot of intellectual history concepts that might be a little heavy for a 10th grader. I'd have to think about that one actually, at that particular point. But for that level, I know when I grew up, I loved the American Heritage Junior Histories of World War II. But for today's environment, it probably would strike people as a little too triumphalist in the classroom.
Okay, the next question is from Melanie Grant, and she's asking, is the museum on Fort Belvoir or adjacent to the base? She's trying to figure out how hard it will be for the public to access it. And she really, because we actually, the Friends of the World War II Memorial, took our teachers to the National Museum of the Marine Corps, and it was a great tour a few years ago.
Yeah, it's right off the Fairfax County Parkway for those who are familiar with the Fort Belvoir area. So it's not, you don't have to really go into the post to get into the museum. It's got a separate access road, although it's, I think it's still on Fort Belvoir property, unless Fort Belvoir transferred it to the Army Historical Foundation. But it's right by Fort Belvoir and not too far from US 1, between US 1 and Interstate 95, so the Newington exit. So you can just it will be pretty accessible when it opens.
Great, thank you. And then Brianne Wechter asks, what approach process do you use when researching and writing official histories? How often do you return to revise them? And do you feel confident in providing multiple perspectives?
Well, official histories, we try to give a full, comprehensive, and balanced story. We're not there to argue particular agendas. So I would say it's a little more than a straight chronicle. A lot of it reads like a chronicle. It's pretty heavy going for folks who aren't really interested in it, but we have various lengths. Some, like we'll do commemorative campaign pamphlets, and those are shorter and more accessible. But we do not. The one thing I do want to emphasize, though, is we do not write court history. That's we are not an adjunct to the Public Affairs Office of the Department of the Army. We try to call the shots as we see them. We are very motivated by the question of why particular decisions were made, without casting blame or aspersion on individuals. In any case, there's a lot of I could go into this a lot more, but I hope that kind of answers the question. How often do we return to revise them? Not really. I don't think we will. We won't go back and redo the green books. I can tell you that.
Okay, and then we have a question from David Trail. What are your favorite World War II films in terms of telling it right?
I've always liked Band of Brothers. I think Band of Brothers was very well done. Saving Private Ryan. Of course, that was a big part of Spielberg's publicity, how realistic it was, and a lot of people watched that first half hour with that in mind. But in terms of But after the first half hour, Saving Private Ryan strikes me as a lot like any other World War II movie. And even in the first half hour, there was a professor who wrote something, HR Perspectives, a number of years back, who pointed out that you could go to an old 60s movie like Beach Red about a Marine landing in the Pacific, and that could get pretty gory too. And yeah, it's kind of goriness with modern technology, in a sense. But there are a lot. Battleground, which was made in the late 40s, that was made with a lot of people who participated in World War II, and there's a gritty realism to it that I find attractive. I actually liked Midway, and thought that was. I wish the Army had that good a sales movie. But I couldn't stand Pearl Harbor, if for nothing else than that the battleships in Pearl Harbor looked like they were made of paper mache. I could go on and on about war.
Now, I'm not seeing any other questions. Does anybody, if I missed any, let me know. Oh, here. Brianne Wechter wrote, if you average it out, how many hours of research reading do you think goes in every page of your writing?
Well, let me put it to you this way, I guess. I'm currently doing a biography of General of the Army Omar Bradley. And I started that biography in October 2011, right about in there. And I've pretty much, I've made it about to North Africa and Sicily. So now I've been writing chapters as I've gone along, but I've spent the last year and a half or so just researching Sicily and North Africa and Sicily. There's so much that goes into it. Probably the proportion is much greater for me in terms of research than it is on writing. I write relatively fast. I'm not, that doesn't necessarily, sometimes I think I pay the price in terms of eloquence, but if you look at the proportion, I'd say 80, maybe even 90% of my time is spent on research and organizing.
Okay, and we have a hand raised from Gordon Sisk. So Gordon, if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Well, mainly a comment. If anybody has not used Saving Private Ryan in the classroom, I know our school system got really excited about R-rated movies and those kind of things, and with the language and stuff in the movie. I was going to tell you one of the first times I showed it, that the landing scene, quite a lot of language in that part, and so as I was, showing it, you really can't understand a lot of the language that's in there at first. But the second class that I showed it in, I thought, when it gets to the really bad part, I'll just hit the mute button. I'll fix that. I thought I was being really clever. Yeah,
get your own censor.
Nah, the closed captioning came up, and it was hilarious. The kids just busted out laughing because you couldn't really tell what they said, but when the closed captioning came up, you could tell exactly what they said. So they about laughed me out of the room, and of course it didn't really bother anybody, but it was hilarious. And so I warned you, if you were going to do that, you might want to practice or check that out. We had to get permission ahead of time for showing movies like that. But anyway, yeah, I got the kids busted me on that one. They thought it was hilarious. So I got teased over that one all year long. So a lot of fun there.
I can imagine. I hope the superintendent didn't call you on the carpet.
He did not. The kids they just razzed me, and we just went on about our business there.
Yep.
Any other questions? Well, we have David with us. Oh, Shane was just mentioning that the students have to sign a permission slip before the course starts for their World War II film class. I'm sure that that's a good thing to have with some of these films. Any other questions, or should we close it up for the day? Oh, we got, what have you written research that you feel is the most unknown but should be taught in high schools? From Brianne.
What have I written? Well, I did a pamphlet a few years back on the history of the Army within a small format. And I've also done commemorative pamphlets on the Civil War, on the Overland Campaign. That sort of thing. It would be interesting to hear how some of those pamphlets would go over in a high school setting. To speak, I tend to like to get into intellectual and cultural background. When I write these broader things, and but I think there are ways, and you folks you're finding ways to bring culture and cultural history into the classroom, and you could just experiment with it and see how that goes. In terms of what else I've written, well. Some of it is very utilitarian in terms of what the Army is. I've written things on special operations in World War II, Rangers, OSS, Office of Strategic Services, American support for the guerrillas in the Philippines, and a lot of the, a friend of mine named Mark Galicchio has written a book. Well, he's written a number of good books, an award-winning book on the War of the Pacific with Waldo Heinrichs. But he's written a very good book on American interactions in Asia, when American GIs went into Asia, and their response to the culture there, and that might be something that people could pick up with and use in a setting. I mean, the whole business of I'd be very curious. In fact, if Holly could give out my email to the class, I would be very curious in terms of ideas on how we approach this kind of audience, 10th graders and everything. Because my tendency has always been to write for professional military education and for scholars. So it'd be nice to get a broader audience.